A desperate escape. In the glimmering halls of the Antaran Imperial Palace, Princess Zura stood alone on her balcony, gazing up at the 3 moons that shone down on the capital city. The night was quiet, but Zyra's mind was not. She could sense the growing unrest, the whispers of rebellion brewing in the dark corners of the empire. As heir to the throne, Zyra had always known her life was in danger. But tonight, the threat felt closer than ever. Her father's reign had grown unpopular, his policies sowing resentment among the people. And Zyra, with her unconventional ideas about reform and equality, had become a target for those who feared change. A sudden commotion in the courtyard below jolted Zyra from her thoughts. She leaned over the balcony, her heart pounding as she saw the flashes of laser fire and heard the shouts of the guards. The palace was under attack. Zyra raced back inside, her long silver hair flying behind her. She had to get to the escape pods. It was the contingency plan her father had drilled into her since childhood. If the palace fell, she was to flee, to preserve the royal bloodline. She sprinted down the winding corridors, the sounds of battle growing louder. Just as she reached the pod bay, a group of rebel soldiers burst through the door, their weapons trained on her. Princess Zyra, their leader, sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "Your reign ends tonight." But Zyra was not helpless. She was an Antaran, gifted with the psychic abilities of her people. With a fierce cry, she unleashed a blast of telekinetic energy, sending the soldiers flying backwards. In the momentary chaos, Zyra leaped into the nearest escape pod, her fingers flying over the controls. The pod shot out of the palace hangar and into the night sky, quickly lost among the stars. As the pod hurtled through space, Zyra allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had escaped, but to what end? She was alone, cut off from her people, her title now meaningless. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her home planet recede into the distance. Days turned to weeks as the pod drifted through the cosmos, its destinations pre-programmed and unalterable. Zyra rationed her supplies, spending her waking hours in meditation, reaching out with her mind to try and sense any friendly presence. But there was only the endless expanse of space. Until one day, a shudder ran through the pod. Zyra snapped out of her trance to see a blue-green planet looming in the viewport. Her heart leaped. Could this be a safe haven? But as the pod descended through the atmosphere, alarms began to blare. The landing sequence had been damaged in her escape, the systems unresponsive to her increasingly desperate commands. The ground rushed up to meet her, a vast expanse of snow and ice. In the final moments before impact, Zyra closed her eyes and reached out one last time with her mind, a plea for help cast into the unknown. Then, with a deafening crash and a flash of blinding light, everything went black. Cold. That was the first sensation that crept into Zyra's consciousness as she slowly clawed her way back to wakefulness, a biting, aching cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her eyelids fluttered open, but the brightness of the snow was too much. She squinted, trying to take in her surroundings. All around her were towering evergreen trees, their branches heavy with snow. The air was crisp and quiet, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind. Zyra tried to sit up and immediately cried out in pain. Her body was battered and bruised, her limbs stiff from cold and lack of movement. How long had she been unconscious? Hours? Days? She looked around frantically for the escape pod, but it was half buried in the snow, its hull cracked and dented. Steam rose from the engines, hissing as it met the frigid air. Zyra's heart sank. The pod was beyond repair. She was stranded. Fighting back tears, Zyra dragged herself from the wreckage. Her formal palace robes were tattered and woefully inadequate against the biting chill. She needed to find shelter, and fast. But as she took a step forward, her leg gave out, sending her sprawling into the snow. As she lay there, shivering and exhausted, a sudden sound cut through the quiet forest. A bark, followed by the crunching of paws on snow. Zyra lifted her head to see a creature bounding towards her, its fur a rich russet red against the white landscape. It was a canine of some sort, Zyra realized, though larger and more powerfully built than any she had seen on Antares. The animal stopped a few paces away, its head cocked to the side as it regarded her with curious eyes. Tentatively, Zyra reached out with her mind, brushing against the edges of the canine's consciousness. She sensed no hostility, only a keen intelligence and a readiness to help. Tears of relief sprang to her eyes. The dog padded closer, nuzzling Zyra's face with its warm, wet nose. She lifted a shaking hand to pet its thick fur, marveling at the softness. The dog leaned into her touch, its tail wagging gently. "Hello, friend," Zyra whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't suppose you know where I could find some help." The dog barked again, its tone almost reassuring. Then, to Zyra's amazement, it lay down beside her in the snow, its body pressing against hers, sharing its warmth. Zyra huddled close to the animal, burying her face in its fur as exhaustion overtook her. She did not know where she was or what the future held. But for now, she was not alone. In the vast, unfamiliar wilderness of this alien world, she had found an unexpected friend. As she drifted off to sleep, Zyra sent a silent prayer of thanks into the cosmos. Perhaps, even in her darkest hour, there was still hope to be found. An unlikely friendship. Zyra awoke to the sensation of a warm, rough tongue licking her face. She opened her eyes to see the russet-furred dog looming over her, its tail wagging enthusiastically. "Good morning to you, too," she mumbled, sitting up gingerly. Her body still ached from the crash, but the biting cold had lessened. Looking around, she realized why. She was inside some kind of primitive shelter, its walls made of rough-hewn logs. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the single room. The dog barked, drawing Zyra's attention back to it. In the light of day, she could see it more clearly. It was a handsome creature, with intelligent eyes and a proud bearing. Around its neck hung a simple leather collar with a metal tag. Zyra leaned forward to read the inscription. "Rusty." "Rusty," she repeated, testing the unfamiliar word on her tongue. "Is that your name?" The dog, Rusty, barked again, its tail wagging faster. Zyra couldn't help but smile. There was something endearing about the animal's earnest, friendly nature. Rusty padded over to the hearth, where a battered metal pot hung over the flames. It nosed at the pot, then looked back at Zyra expectantly. Curious, she got to her feet and hobbled over to investigate. Inside the pot was some kind of stew, thick and hearty smelling. Her stomach growled at the scent. It had been so long since she'd had a proper meal. Rusty watched as Zyra carefully ladled some of the stew into a wooden bowl. She blew on it to cool it, then took a tentative sip. The flavors were unfamiliar but not unpleasant, rich and meaty, with a hint of unfamiliar spices. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful. As she ate, Zyra took stock of her surroundings. The cabin was sparse but functional, with a bed, a table, and a few rickety chairs. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a fragrant, musty scent. Outside the single window, the snowy forest stretched as far as the eye could see. Zyra's mind raced as she considered her next steps. She needed to find a way to repair her escape pod, or at least salvage its communication system to send a distress signal. But she also needed to learn more about this world she had crashed on. What kind of place was it? Were the inhabitants friendly or hostile? And how had Rusty come to be here, in this lonely cabin in the woods? As if sensing her thoughts, Rusty nudged Zyra's hand with his nose. She stroked his soft ears, finding comfort in the simple contact. "Looks like it's just you and me for now, buddy," she said softly. "We're going to have to work together to get through this." Over the next few days, Zyra and Rusty fell into a routine of sorts. During the day, they would venture out into the forest, Rusty leading the way through the snow-covered trails. Zyra marveled at the beauty of the alien landscape, the towering pines, the glittering frozen streams, the occasional glimpse of strange, furry creatures darting through the underbrush. Rusty proved to be an invaluable companion. his keen senses alerting Zaira to potential dangers and guiding her to sources of food and water. He would dig up roots and tubers, or lead her to bury bushes heavy with fruit. In the evenings, they would return to the cabin, where Zaira would prepare their meals over the fire while Rusty dozed at her feet. As the days turned to weeks, Zaira found herself growing increasingly fond of her canine friend. There was a simplicity to their existence out here in the wilderness, a peacefulness that stood in stark contrast to the intrigue and danger of her former life in the palace. But even as she savored this newfound tranquility, Zaira knew it could not last forever. She had a duty to her people, a responsibility to find a way back home and set things right. And yet, a small part of her yearned to stay here, in this quiet corner of the universe, with only Rusty for company. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Zaira voiced these thoughts aloud. Rusty lifted his head from his paws, his ears perked up as if he understood every word. "I don't know what to do, Rusty," Zaira confessed, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of failing my people, scared of never finding a way home. But I'm also scared of leaving this place, of leaving you." Rusty whined softly, then got to his feet and padded over to Zaira. He rested his head on her knee, gazing up at her with those soulful brown eyes. Zaira felt a rush of affection for the loyal creature. "You've been such a good friend to me," she whispered, burying her face in Rusty's thick fur. "I promise, whatever happens, I won't forget that. I won't forget you." As if in response, Rusty licked her cheek, his tail thumping gently against the floor. And in that moment, despite all the uncertainty that lay ahead, Zaira felt a glimmer of hope. She had an ally in this strange new world, a bond forged in the fires of adversity. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would find a way home. Danger on the horizon. The first sign of trouble came on a clear, cold morning, as Zaira and Rusty were out foraging for food. They were deep in the forest, Zaira digging up roots while Rusty sniffed around the base of a tree, when suddenly the dog's head snapped up, his body going rigid. Zaira paused, a trickle of unease running down her spine. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, scanning the trees around them. Rusty growled low in his throat, his hackles rising. He took a step forward, placing himself between Zaira and whatever unseen threat he had sensed. That's when Zaira heard it, the unmistakable hum of a spacecraft engine, growing louder by the second. Her heart leaped into her throat. Could it be a rescue party from Antares? But no, she realized with a sinking feeling. The engine noise was too rough, too aggressive. These were not friendly ships. "We need to go," she hissed to Rusty, grabbing her bag of foraged roots. "Now." They ran, darting between the trees as the sound of the ships grew ever closer. Laser blasts suddenly sizzled through the air around them, scorching the trunks of the pines. Zaira yelped, ducking her head as a shot narrowly missed her. Rusty barked frantically, veering off the path and into a dense thicket. Zaira followed, branches whipping at her face and body as they crashed through the underbrush. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of pursuit. Heavy boots crunching through the snow, harsh voices shouting in a language she didn't recognize. They ran until Zaira's lungs burned and her legs felt like rubber, until the sounds of their pursuers faded into the distance. Finally, they collapsed at the base of a large tree, panting heavily. "Bounty hunters," Zaira gasped out, once she had caught her breath. "They must have tracked my escape pod." A cold fear gripped her heart. If the hunters had found her, it was only a matter of time before they closed in for the kill. Rusty pressed against her side, whining softly as if he sensed her distress. Zaira hugged him close, taking comfort in his solid warmth. "We can't go back to the cabin," she said, her mind racing. "It's not safe anymore. We need to keep moving, find somewhere to hide out until I can figure out a plan." And so began a new chapter in their journey, a desperate flight through the wilderness, staying one step ahead of the relentless bounty hunters on their trail. They traveled by night, huddled together for warmth under makeshift shelters of pine boughs and snow. By day, they foraged for what meager food they could find, always keeping a wary eye on the sky for any sign of the hunters' ships. It was a hard existence, one that pushed Zara to the limits of her endurance both physically and mentally. There were moments when she was tempted to give in to despair, to simply lie down in the snow and let the cold and the hunters claim her. But always Rusty was there, a constant, comforting presence at her side. He seemed to sense when her spirits were at their lowest, and would nuzzle her hand or lick her face until she couldn't help but smile. In those darkest of moments, it was his unwavering loyalty and affection that kept her going, that gave her the strength to take one more step, to face one more day. As they trekked deeper into the mountains, the terrain grew harsher, the weather more unforgiving. Blizzards raged for days on end, the wind howling like a living thing. They took shelter where they could, in caves, in the hollows beneath fallen trees, huddled together for warmth as the world outside turned to a swirling white nightmare. It was during one such storm that disaster struck. They were picking their way along a narrow ridge, the path ahead obscured by driving snow, when suddenly the ground gave way beneath Zara's feet. She screamed as she fell, tumbling down the steep slope in a confusion of snow and ice and blinding pain. When she finally came to a stop, she lay stunned, the breath knocked from her lungs. Every part of her body hurt, a searing agony that made even the simple act of breathing a torment. Through the haze of pain, she heard Rusty barking frantically somewhere above her, a note of pure anguish in his voice. "Rusty," she tried to call out, but her voice was a mere whisper, lost in the howling of the wind. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, a seductive promise of oblivion. She felt herself slipping away, her consciousness unraveling like a spool of thread. But then, impossibly, she felt a warm, wet nose nuzzling her cheek, heard the thump of a tail against the snow. Rusty had found her, had somehow made his way down the treacherous slope to her side. He licked her face, whining with concern. The touch of his tongue was like an anchor, tethering Zara back to wakefulness. She blinked, fighting against the pull of the darkness. Rusty barked encouragingly, nosing at her until she managed to sit up, crying out at the lance of pain that shot through her leg. It was broken, she realized with a sob of despair. The bone jutted through the skin, a sickening sight. How was she going to go on now, with the hunters still out there, closing in? She was as good as dead. But Rusty would not give up on her. He curled around her shivering form, lending her his warmth and strength. And as Zara huddled there in the snow, her face buried in the dog's thick fur, she felt a flicker of something unexpected kindling in her chest, a tiny, stubborn spark of hope. She had survived the crash, the cold, the hunter's pursuit, all because of Rusty, because of the bond they shared. As long as they had each other, she realized, there was still a chance. They would find a way through this, together. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Zara forced herself to her feet, leaning heavily on Rusty for support. Step by agonizing step, they set off into the blizzard, two small, determined figures in a vast, frozen landscape, a princess and her loyal dog, united against all odds, determined to live to fight another day. Discovering humanity. Days blurred into weeks as Zara and Rusty trekked through the wilderness, Zara leaning heavily on the dog for support as her broken leg slowly mended. They'd rationed their meager supplies, supplementing with whatever Rusty could forage or catch. It was a lean existence, one that left Zara's cheeks hollow and her ribs prominently visible beneath her tattered clothes. But through it all, Rusty remained a stalwart companion, his presence a constant comfort. He seemed to know instinctively when Zara needed rest, guiding her to sheltered spots and standing guard as she slept. And in the long hours of their journey, as they walked side by side through the silent, snow-draped forest, Zara found herself talking to the dog, sharing stories of her home, her family, her hopes and fears. It was during one of these one-sided conversations that they first spotted signs of human habitation, a thin wisp of smoke curling above the treetops in the distance. Zaira's heart leaped at the sight, a sudden wild hope surging through her veins. But as they drew closer, trepidation replaced excitement. She knew nothing of the inhabitants of this world, of their customs or intentions. Would they welcome a stranger, or view her with suspicion and hostility? Rusty seemed to sense her hesitation, pressing close to her side in silent reassurance. Zaira drew in a deep, steadying breath, squaring her shoulders. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same courage and determination that had brought her this far. As they approached the outskirts of the settlement, a small rustic village nestled in a picturesque valley, Zaira couldn't help but marvel at the sights and sounds that greeted her. The buildings were simple but sturdy, constructed of rough-hewn logs and thatched roofs. Smoke drifted from stone chimneys, carrying the enticing scent of cooking food. And everywhere, there were people, men, women, and children going about their daily lives, talking and laughing and working. They looked so different from her own people, with their varied skin tones and round, expressive eyes. But as Zaira watched them, she was struck by a sense of familiarity. The way a mother cradled her child, the playful shouts of children chasing each other through the streets, the easy camaraderie of the adults as they worked side by side. These were universal constants, transcending the boundaries of species and culture. As Zaira and Rusty made their way into the heart of the village, heads began to turn, eyes widening in surprise and curiosity at the sight of the strange pair. Zaira felt a flush of self-consciousness, acutely aware of her alien appearance and ragged state. But before unease could take hold, a voice rang out across the square. "Well now, what have we here?" A man was approaching them, his gait easy and unhurried. He was older, with a weathered face and a shock of graying hair, but his eyes were kind, crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Looks like you've been through quite an ordeal, miss," he said, coming to a stop before them. His gaze flicked over Zaira, taking in her tattered clothing and the makeshift splint on her leg, before settling on her face. If he was shocked by her appearance, he gave no sign. Beside her, Rusty's tail began to wag, a tentative greeting. The man chuckled, reaching out to scratch the dog behind the ears. "And who's this handsome fellow? He seems quite taken with you." Zaira swallowed hard, suddenly finding it difficult to speak past the lump in her throat. It had been so long since she had interacted with anyone other than Rusty. "His name is Rusty," she managed, her voice rusty from disuse. "He's been my companion, my protector. I owe him my life." The man's smile widened, his eyes warm with understanding. "Sounds like you two have quite a story to tell. Why don't you come with me? We'll get you fixed up, get some food in your belly. Then, if you're willing, we'd love to hear your tale." Zaira hesitated, old habits of caution warring with the bone-deep weariness that suffused her body. But as she looked around at the faces of the villagers, at the open curiosity and kindness she saw there, she felt something unclench inside her. Here, perhaps, she could find more than just a temporary respite. Here she might find understanding, acceptance, a chance at a new beginning. "Thank you," she said softly, sincerity ringing in every word. "I would like that very much." In the days that followed, as Zaira recuperated under the care of the village healer, she slowly began to share her story. She spoke of her home world, of the coup that had driven her into exile, of her desperate flight across the stars. She spoke of her crash landing on this alien planet, of the hardships and dangers she had faced. And she spoke of Rusty, of the unwavering loyalty and friendship that had sustained her through it all. The villagers listened with rapt attention, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: wonder, sympathy, admiration. They marveled at her tales of advanced technology and alien civilizations, but it was the story of her bond with Rusty that seemed to resonate most deeply. For as Zaira soon learned, these humans placed great value on the bonds between individuals, whether human or animal. Many of them had their own stories of cherished pets or working animals that were more than mere beasts. They were partners, family members, friends. As Zaira's strength returned, and she began to venture out into the village more, Rusty always at her side. She found herself being drawn into the rhythms of daily life. The villagers welcomed her into their homes, sharing their meals and their stories. The children, in particular, were fascinated by her, constantly clamoring for tales of her adventures or demonstrations of the small feats of elemental manipulation she could still perform even in her weakened state. And through it all, Rusty was a constant presence, a bridge between Zyra and these strange new people. His easy affection and playful antics won hearts wherever he went, and more than once, Zyra overheard the villagers remarking on the extraordinary nature of their bond. It was a bond that would soon be tested once more. For even as Zyra began to find a measure of peace and belonging among the humans, she knew that the danger had not passed. Somewhere out there, the bounty hunters were still searching for her, still intent on claiming their prize. She would need all the strength and cunning she possessed, all the loyalty and courage of her canine companion, to face the trials ahead. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by the warmth and acceptance of her new friends, Zyra allowed herself to hope, to believe that, no matter what the future held, she would not have to face it alone. The hunt intensifies. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. It was a clear, cold morning, the kind that dawned crisp and bright, the sun glinting off the fresh snow. Zyra was just returning from a walk with Rusty, her cheeks flushed and her spirits high, when the first laser blast seared through the peaceful morning air. Screams erupted from the village square as more blasts followed, sizzling through the walls of buildings and sending villagers diving for cover. Zyra's heart seized in her chest. She knew, with a sickening certainty, what this meant. The bounty hunters had found her. Rusty was already in motion, hackles raised, a snarl rumbling in his throat. He positioned himself in front of Zyra, ready to defend her to the last. But Zyra knew it would not be enough, not against the advanced weapons and ruthless determination of her pursuers. She had to act, had to use every resource at her disposal to protect these innocent people who had taken her in, who had shown her such kindness and acceptance. Ignoring the cries of alarm from the villagers, Zyra stepped out into the open, her hands raised in a gesture of supplication. The bounty hunters were deploying from their ship at the edge of the village, a squad of heavily armed, hardened men and women. As they caught sight of her, a ripple of excitement passed through their ranks. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the prize they had pursued across the stars. But Zyra had no intention of coming quietly. Reaching deep within herself, she called upon the elemental powers that were her birthright. The air around her began to crackle with energy, her hair lifting in an unseen breeze. The bounty hunters hesitated, unease flickering across their faces. They had come prepared for a fight, but not for this, not for a display of raw elemental power unlike anything their technology could match. With a cry that was equal parts defiance and desperation, Zyra unleashed her power. Gusts of hurricane-force wind slammed into the hunters, knocking them off their feet. Spikes of ice erupted from the ground, impaling those too slow to dodge. Lightning crackled from Zyra's fingertips, seeking out the metallic weapons and armor of her foes. For a moment, it seemed as though Zyra's power would be enough. The hunters were in disarray, their advance halted by the ferocity of her assault. But they were professionals, and they adapted quickly, spreading out to surround her. They began to lay down a withering hail of laser fire, forcing Zyra to divert her energy into maintaining a shimmering shield of air around herself and Rusty. It was a losing battle, and Zyra knew it. Her strength was waning, sapped by weeks of hardship and the unfamiliarity of this planet's elements. She could not keep this up forever. Just as despair began to seize her, a new sound filled the air, the defiant shouts of the villagers. They had overcome their initial shock and were rallying, grabbing whatever makeshift weapons came to hand, tools, farming implements, fire irons from their hearths. Led by the gray-haired man who had first welcomed Zyra, they charged into the fray, their courage and determination a match for any bounty hunter's firepower. Rusty, Two leaped into action, a snarling whirlwind of teeth and fury. He brought down hunter after hunter, his jaws clamping on limbs and throats, heedless of the laser blasts that singed his fur. Zyra felt a surge of new strength at the sight of her friends, human and canine alike, fighting for her. With a final mighty effort, she summoned a swirling vortex of wind and snow, a miniature blizzard that engulfed the remaining hunters, blinding and disorienting them. In the confusion, the villagers pressed their advantage. The ring of steel and the sizzle of lasers mingled with cries of pain and fury. But when the snow finally settled and the echoes faded, it was the hunters who lay defeated, their weapons shattered, their will to fight broken. A cheer went up from the villagers, a roar of triumph and relief. They had defended their own, had stood against a threat beyond their understanding, and emerged victorious. As they gathered around Zyra, clapping her on the back and marveling at her powers, she felt a swell of emotion unlike anything she had ever known. Here, on this alien world, among these people so different from her own, she had found something she had never expected, a sense of belonging, of kinship that transcended all boundaries. And at the center of it all was Rusty, his tail wagging furiously as the children of the village hugged and petted him, hailing him as a hero. He had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited this unlikely alliance, this bond between a princess and a village, between a woman and a dog. As the celebrations continued into the night with bonfires and feasting and laughter ringing out beneath the stars, Zyra knew that this was not the end of her journey. She still had a duty to her people, a throne to reclaim and a world to set right. But she also knew that she would not have to face that future alone. She had found allies here, friends who would stand with her through whatever trials lay ahead. And she had Rusty, her constant companion, her loyal friend. Together, they were more than a princess and a dog. They were a symbol of the unbreakable bonds that could form between living beings, of the strength and resilience of the spirit. They were a reminder that no matter how lost or alone one might feel, there was always hope, hope for understanding, for acceptance, for love. And that was a power greater than any elemental force, a magic that could change the course of worlds. A new home. In the days following the battle, as the village worked to repair the damage and tend to the wounded, Zyra knew that the time had come to make a decision. The bounty hunters had been defeated, but more would come. As long as she remained on Earth, she would be putting her new friends in danger. She had to return to Antares, had to confront the usurpers who had stolen her throne, and set right the wrongs that had been done. But the thought of leaving, of saying goodbye to these people who had become so dear to her, tore at her heart. And the thought of parting from Rusty, her constant companion and loyal friend, was almost too much to bear. It was Rusty who ultimately helped her make the decision. In a quiet moment, as they sat together watching the sun set over the mountains, Zyra poured out her heart to the dog, confessing her fears and doubts. Rusty listened, his warm brown eyes fixed on her face, his head resting on her knee. And when she fell silent, he raised his head and looked deep into her eyes. And in that gaze, Zyra saw a depth of understanding and commitment that took her breath away. Rusty would go with her. Of course he would. Their bond was unbreakable, their destiny intertwined. Where she went, he would follow, no matter the danger, no matter the cost. Tears of gratitude and love filled Zyra's eyes as she hugged the dog close, burying her face in his thick fur. With Rusty by her side, she felt she could face anything. The villagers, when she told them of her decision, were saddened but understanding. They had always known she would not stay forever, that her destiny lay beyond the boundaries of their small world. But they were determined to help in any way they could. Working together, they modified one of the bounty hunters' ships, equipping it for the long journey back to Antares. They gathered supplies and provisions, and crafted gifts for Zyra to take with her, tokens of their friendship and remembrance. On the morning of her departure, the entire village gathered to see her off. There were tears and embraces, promises to remember and to hold the stories of their time together close to their hearts. As Zara stood at the threshold of the ship, Rusty at her side, she looked out over the faces of her friends, her heart full to bursting. "I will never forget you," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "What you have given me, your kindness, your courage, your acceptance, it has changed me forever. You have shown me the true strength of the human spirit and the power of the bonds that connect all living things. I go forth now to face my destiny, but I carry a part of each of you with me. And I promise, when my throne is secure and my world is at peace, I will return. This is not goodbye, but a new beginning." With a final wave and a last, lingering look, Zara boarded the ship, Rusty leaping up behind her. The engines roared to life, and the craft lifted into the sky, quickly dwindling to a speck against the blue. The villagers watched until it disappeared, their hearts full of hope and wonder. They knew they had been part of something extraordinary, a story that would be told and retold for generations to come. The story of an alien princess and a loyal dog, of a village that stood against the darkness, of the unbreakable bonds that could form between the most unlikely of friends. It was a story of courage and compassion, of resilience and hope. A story that proved, beyond all doubt, that the human spirit, and the spirit of all living things, was a force to be reckoned with. And though the princess was gone, her presence lingered, a warm glow that suffused the village and the hearts of all who had known her. They would go on with their lives, facing the challenges and joys of each new day. But they would never forget, never cease to marvel at the miracles that could happen when hearts opened and hands reached out in friendship and love. For that was the true magic of the universe, the power that could change the course of worlds and make even the most impossible dreams come true. And in a small village nestled in the mountains of a distant planet, that magic had touched the lives of an alien princess, a loyal dog, and a community of brave and compassionate humans. And the universe would never be the same. Epilogue. Far across the galaxy, on a world reborn, Empress Zira sat on her throne, Rusty curled at her feet. It had been a long and difficult road, but they had prevailed. With the help of her allies and the strength of her own resolve, Zira had reclaimed her birthright and brought peace and prosperity to her people. And through it all, Rusty had been by her side, a constant reminder of the lessons she had learned on that distant blue-green planet. Now, as she looked out over the thriving cities and verdant landscapes of Antares, Zira's heart swelled with gratitude and joy. She had fulfilled her promise, had forged a new era of understanding and cooperation between her world and the many races of the galaxy. And at the heart of it all was the bond she shared with Rusty, a bond that had started with an act of compassion and grown into a force that could change the universe. For in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all. That love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force in existence. And as long as there were beings willing to open their hearts and stand together, there was nothing that could not be achieved, no dream that could not be made real. Zira smiled, reaching down to stroke Rusty's fur. Together, they had come so far, had overcome so much. And together, they would continue to shine a light of hope and unity, a beacon for all who dared to believe in the power of love and the unbreakable strength of the bonds that connect us all.